Here's the weird part. You go looking for Danu like she's going to walk on stage, and she doesn't. Modern retellings speak her name with total confidence. They'll tell you she's the great mother goddess of Ireland, the river goddess, the source behind an entire divine race. So you do what you're supposed to do. You follow the trail backward, and the trail gets quieter, older, messier. Because when you reach the material that's actually close to the medieval record, Danu doesn't arrive with a story attached. No scene, no clear voice. Sometimes, not even a clean, direct mention. What you keep finding is the name, hanging there like a shadow. And the question isn't, who was she? Not at first. The question is, how does a shadow become a goddess? Okay, so this episode isn't about proving Danu was real in the way modern summaries want her to be. It's about watching a myth take shape. We're going to separate 3 layers. Not because it's neat, but the moment you mix them, everything starts to blur. First, the oldest trail we can actually point to, the medieval Irish texts, the names, the way the scribes framed the world they were recording. Then the interpretations, what scholars and reference works cautiously infer from fragments, word forms, and connections that might be there, or might be us reading backward. And finally, the echo chamber, the modern version that spreads through wikis, blogs, and threads, where a gap in the record becomes an invitation to fill it. Along the way, we'll keep a few questions open. Is Danu the same figure as Anu? Or are we watching names get fused because they sound like they belong together? Why does divine waters show up so often, especially when people start pointing at rivers with similar names? And if Danu is mostly a name attached to the Tuatha Dé Danann, what does that say about how mythic family trees get built in the first place? By the end, you'll have something better than a clean biography. You'll see where the record ends, and where the story starts doing the rest. Because once a definition hardens into a template, it doesn't just explain the past, it starts rewriting memory. So if we're staying honest with the oldest trail, we have to start where the manuscripts actually give us something solid. You don't meet Danu as a speaking character. You meet a people. Tuatha Dé Danann. That phrase is where the medieval record becomes visible. It's the label the texts use for the supernatural race at the heart of Ireland's mythological cycle. The ones who move through a world that still feels half myth, half history, even on the page. And the page matters here, because what survives was written down in monasteries, long after the world it describes. Copied, recopied, shaped by scribes who lived inside a Christian frame. You can feel the organizing impulse in the writing. Myth starts to read like a national memory trying to stay in order. Also, there isn't one Danu book. What survives is a mix, compilations and glosses, battle tales and place lore, stitched together by time and copying. So instead of hunting for a single origin scene, you follow how the name behaves across the tradition. One of the major compilations that holds the scaffolding is the Libor Gabala Erin, the Book of the Taking of Ireland. It reads like an origin history, a sequence of arrivals and takeovers, Ireland as a stage that keeps changing hands. And when the Tuatha Dé Danann appear in that framework, they don't arrive with a neat label like, these are gods. They come in as something older than ordinary people, figures associated with power, knowledge, and presence. The text treats them as the kind of force that changes the island's temperature. This is also where the Danu trail gets its most concrete clue. In the Libor Gabala tradition, the Danann part of the name is linked to a figure called Danand, presented as a daughter of Delbeth. The writing ties the people's label to her line. That's important, because it means the earliest written anchor for Danann isn't a dramatic myth moment. It's a family tree hook, brief, functional, and very medieval in its logic. In the earliest written scaffolding, Danann is anchored by genealogy, Danand in a lineage line, more like a medieval filing label than a mythic scene. Then there are the battle texts. In Cath Maga Tuired, the battles of Mag Tuired, the Tuatha Dé Danann aren't background. You get enemies, champions, pressure, aftermath. The writing doesn't pause to explain what a divine race is supposed to look like. It just shows a world where certain beings have authority, craft, and weapons that feel like more than metal. And you can feel something else there too. Even when these beings lose the surface of Ireland in later story logic, they don't simply vanish, they slip sideways. The landscape becomes more than scenery. it becomes a hiding place. That same anchoring shows up in the Dinshenchus, the place lore tradition. Hills, mounds, rivers, names that carry memory. Even when the Tuatha Dé Danann aren't ruling the island in plain daylight, the texts keep them attached to geography. The supernatural doesn't disappear, it relocates. Now, a small detail that becomes bigger the longer you sit with it. The scribes don't always use the full tag. In places, the supernatural race is simply Tuatha Dé, literally, the people of the gods. But when the phrase becomes Tuatha Dé Danann, it stops being only a category. It becomes an origin marker. It points behind the gods, toward a source. And the word form itself is part of what makes this so slippery. Danann shows up in places where you'd expect a genitive, something like of Danann. In Irish, those little endings carry relationship. They can tell you who belongs to who, where something comes from, how a name sits inside a larger structure. So later readers see Danann and hear a missing base form behind it, the kind of name you'd expect to see in the nominative. That's where Danu enters the conversation. Not as a scene the manuscripts hand you, but as a name shape that seems to be implied by the way the phrase works. And right beside that, in a separate but nearby corner of the same manuscript world, you also find another mother name, Anna, sometimes rendered as Anu or Anan, appearing in a short glossary entry as Mother of the Gods of Ireland. It's brief. It isn't a full myth, but it exists on the page in a way that feels frustratingly close to what people want for Danu. That tiny glossary claim is a payoff in itself. It's a Mother of the Gods line on the page, but it's attached to Anna/Anu/Anan, not to Danu. Keep that in mind. Not because we're going to stop the story and lecture you about layers, but because this is exactly how the payoff works later. A name appears in one place, a hint shows up in another, and your brain wants to connect them. So let's hold this story to a pause right here. The oldest written trail gives us the Tuatha Dé Danann, gives us Danann as the form that actually appears, and gives us a thin genealogical anchor through Danann. What it does not hand us is Danu as a full character with her own cycle of scenes. Let that sit there for now. So here's what happens once that medieval trail is on the page. A label like Tuatha Dé Danann doesn't stay frozen. It gets copied and translated, then represented again and again. Each pass changes what the name feels like, even when the underlying texts haven't moved an inch. In the manuscripts, Danann mostly shows up as a form that implies relationship. It behaves like of Danann, the kind of thing you attach to a people group. But once you move into English, and once readers start expecting a clean, simple name, your eye keeps snagging on that ending, because it looks like there should be a base form hiding behind it. In Irish, that shift matters more than it does in English. Names change shape depending on case. Those endings tell you who belongs to who, or where something comes from. So when later editors and translators present Danann in English print, the form can look like a person's name that's missing its plainest version. And once something looks like it's missing, readers go looking for what should be there. Different editions normalize different spellings. One manuscript might preserve Danann in a genealogical line. Another keeps Danann in the group name. Modern print smooths the bumps, and that smoothing has a side effect. It makes the implied figure feel cleaner than the record ever was. Dé Danann reads like people of Danann. The grammar makes you imagine a Danann behind the phrase, even if no story ever brings her on stage. That's where the reconstructed Danu starts to show up more clearly in later writing. Not as a brand new character with a single origin point, but as an answer to a question the phrase keeps asking. Of whom? Of what? Who is Danann? And once you ask that, the name starts pulling in nearby material. One of the closest pieces is a short line in the medieval glossary tradition, Anna, sometimes spelled Anu or Annan, described as a mother of the gods of Ireland. It isn't a narrative. It doesn't give you a scene to film, but it's a mother name sitting in the same manuscript world, and it shifts the weight of the question. So the names start to drift toward each other. Not because a text suddenly declares, these are the same goddess. The drift is quieter. It happens in footnotes and translation choices, and in the way summaries compress messy traditions into something readable. Danann sits near Anan. Anna reads like a mother name. Danu is the base form people expect. After a while, the distance between them starts to feel smaller. Then another current pulls in, and it's older than the internet. It's language itself. Across Indo-European studies, there's a habit of noticing river names that resemble a root meaning something like river or flowing waters. The Danube is the famous one. The Don shows up too, and there are others that get pulled into the same family. So once Danu is on the table as a plausible name shape, water arrives almost automatically as an image. It's an easy fit. It sticks. And once a name comes with an image, it becomes easier to picture in your head. At that point, Danu doesn't have to be introduced as a footnote inside a people group. She can be introduced as the headline. A sentence that used to orbit Tuatha Dé Danann starts to orbit her instead. You can see the shift in the way later references are written. Earlier mentions tend to keep her inside the label. Later mentions put her at the front of the paragraph, then work backward. The medieval texts haven't changed. The doorway has. And once that doorway exists, it shapes what you notice. You stop asking why the mother is off camera. You start reading the name as if the camera was always pointed at her. That's the quiet trick of passing it along. Every retelling feels like a clarification, even when it's really a choice. Now pause for a second, because it's easy to lose the thread. We began with Tuatha Dé Danann on a medieval page, and Danann behaving like a relationship form. We still don't have a clean myth cycle where Danu walks around doing things. What changes is everything that gathers around the silence. Over time, the reconstructed base name becomes common. The mother name in the glossary adds weight. The river root adds imagery. Once those pieces sit next to each other long enough, the mind starts treating them as one coherent portrait, and that portrait keeps evolving. The 19th century mattered here. Celtic revivalism and Romantic era longing for lost Europe pushed people toward big, symbolic mother figures, especially ones you could connect to land and water without needing a single definitive story. Folklore collecting and comparative mythology encouraged wide categories, and Danu fits those categories almost too well. Then the 20th century does something different. It turns that mood into something stable: reference books, encyclopedias, classroom summaries. The name becomes an entry, and an entry has gravity. People quote it. It gets taught. It becomes the quick definition you see first. And that's when the name really starts to gain mass. Not with one dramatic revelation, but with repetition. A phrasing gets copied. A definition gets recycled. After enough cycles, the wording hardens into a template, and the template starts feeling like the source. Even careful writers fall into it because those lines are convenient. They fit in an intro paragraph. They look authoritative. And once they're in print, they're hard to dislodge. By the time modern pagan and Reconstructionist communities begin trading notes across countries, Danu is already familiar enough to be invoked, even if no one can point to a single scene where she speaks. The absence of a fixed story doesn't stop devotion. In some places, it even helps. It leaves room for personal myth to grow around the name. And then the modern world speeds everything up. By then, search results don't hand you the manuscripts first. They hand you the template first, and it's hard not to mistake that for age. Hold on to that feeling for a moment. Because the closer we get to the present, the louder the story becomes, and the easier it is to forget how quiet the earliest trail really is. If you feel the story getting smoother as we move forward, that's a clue you're reading later layers doing their job. So now, we're close enough to the present that the story starts feeling solid. That's the danger zone. Because the smoother the portrait becomes, the easier it is to forget what we actually started with: a people on a medieval page, plus a name form attached to them, while the supposed mother stays off camera. If you keep that in the back of your mind, the modern version starts to explain itself. When summaries call Danu the mother goddess, they're usually reacting to a real pattern in the written tradition. The Tuatha Dé Danann are treated as a supernatural race, and Danann sits behind their name like an origin marker. It's not nothing. The trouble is what happens next. A marker starts reading like a person the moment you begin writing sentences that start with her name. And once that happens, the rest of the portrait writes itself. So instead of arguing about beliefs, let's hold the old photo up to the light and see what's actually there. Here's the hard line. On the medieval page, we get Tuatha Dé Danann, the genitive Danann, a thin genealogical anchor through Danann, and a nearby mother name in the glosses. Everything beyond that, Danu as a named mother, a water domain, a stable biography, is interpretation that grows louder the closer we get to the present. Now we reach the loudest part of the story. Online, that template gets copy-pasted from site to site. After enough repeats, the copy looks like consensus, and consensus looks like a source. That's how the shadow turns into a face. But there's another twist that makes Danu even bigger online, and it has nothing to do with Ireland. It's the way names collide. Danu isn't a name that belongs to one culture. It shows up elsewhere, in other traditions, with its own separate stories. In Vedic tradition, there's a primordial figure named Danu, mentioned in the Rig Veda as the mother of the Danavas. Then later descriptions lean into the idea of primeval waters around her name. In Bali, there's Dewi Danu, a water goddess tied to lakes and irrigation. Temples were built in her honor. Once those separate Danu names are in the same search space, the internet treats them like pieces of one puzzle, even when the traditions never connect on the page. Now place that next to a European map full of river names that sound like Danu, and the brain does what it always does. It tries to unify the pattern. A connection starts to feel inevitable. It feels elegant, ancient even. And that feeling is exactly why crosslinks spread so easily. Sometimes those connections are wrong. Sometimes they're just unprovable. Either way, the process is real. This is how modern mythology gets made. Not by one person deciding to lie, but by lots of small, reasonable moves that add up. An editorial choice, a summary line, a recycled paragraph, a name that looks familiar, a theme that feels right. And notice how subtle the shift is. Nobody needs to announce it. You don't get a trumpet blast that says, "Now we're switching from text to interpretation." It just happens when a tidy sentence is easier to remember than a messy record. That's why those small details we flagged earlier matter. The endings, the spellings, the way Danann sits in the phrase. They're quiet, but they're the parts that actually touch the page. So what do we do with Danu if we're trying to stay honest? We hold two truths at once. The medieval record gives us a divine people and a name that points backward. It gives us nearby mother language in the same manuscript world. It does not give us a goddess walking through scenes with a stable biography. And the modern world gives us a figure built around that absence, shaped by language, by scholarship, and by the human habit of finishing the sentence. If you've ever wondered why Danu feels both ancient and strangely modern at the same time, that's why. She's old enough to be implied by medieval names, but the version most people meet is the one that later centuries made easier to say out loud. Here's the practical test I use when a myth starts sounding too clean. Don't ask, "Is it true?" Ask, "Where does it touch the page?" If you can point to a medieval line that says it plainly, you keep it. If it only exists as a smooth summary that no one can trace back, you treat it like a later reading. That doesn't mean it's useless. It just means you don't confuse it with the source. And once you stop confusing those two things, the whole Danu puzzle becomes watchable instead of frustrating. You can see the quiet beginning. You can hear the later polish. And you can tell when the story is filling in the silence for you. So here's where I land with Danu. I don't think the name came out of nowhere. Names like this don't survive on paper by accident. Someone wrote it down for a reason. Something mattered enough to mark. But whatever that original reason was, we can't point to it anymore. The trail doesn't give us the moment where someone explains what she meant. All we have is what survived. And if you've made it this far, seriously, thanks for watching. Normally I wouldn't ask this, but if you want to help the channel and more stories like this, you can like and subscribe. It helps more than you think. Also, if this episode clicked for you, I want to point you to something related. I did a video on Asheth Zenunim, another case where a name turns into something bigger than a name. That video is on the end screen now. Just click it while it's up, and we'll keep going down this trail together. See you in the next story.